All right, I got actually flipped 11:02. I'm going to go ahead and start us off. Hi, welcome to our remote research roundtable for the College of Education and Human Development. My name is Frank Simons, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a faculty member in the Special Ed program, Department of Ed Psych. I also serve as the Collegiate Associate Dean for Research. And first, I hope everybody's well. And these are different times. I know these are busy times, the best of times, because it's end of semester. Made more so by everything being remote. For those of you joining, I'm going to go over the housekeeping. For those of you who couldn't make it and see this later, obviously it's recording. So for those of you participating, this is recording. We have happily in our backyard expertise on remote research strategies, and I picked one theme in particular: telehealth approaches. And so I'm very happy and delighted to be able to say we have Jennifer McComas, Adele Dimian, and Jessica Simichek, who are, again, experts in our own backyard to speak to telehealth procedures. And what I asked them, all of them have expertise specific to research and outreach and training and how to use this. But for the purposes of our audience, I cut it up into three chunks where we have a tutorial, an overview, the mechanics of how this gets set up and what it looks like, and then a piece specific to how it's been used in outreach and training and staff training and the issues that can come up in that kind of context, and then some examples of research applications. We may see some overlap, and that's fine, because for those of you for whom this is new or new idea, or who have some sense of it but aren't sure, it's okay to see things a few times and hear them. The way I was going to structure this, we just had this conversation quickly, is each presentation goes about 15 minutes plus or minus, and we can do the chat function for questions at the end. And I will continue to serve as moderator. I can read those in a first come, first serve, and whoever's presenting can then answer. So we'll do that. If there's something that you absolutely need answered in the middle of somebody's talk, then go ahead again with the chat. We can do that. And then depending on timing, with the remaining time left after the three presentations and the specific Q&A, we can continue in a general Q&A. We posted for 1 hour. I've eaten up 2 minutes of it. So I'm going to, without further ado, stop and turn this over to Adele Dimian. Adele is in the Institute for Community Integration and is going to lead us off with the opening tutorial type talk. Adele, it's all you.
Thank you, Frank. Just gonna play my slideshow here. Good morning, everyone. I hope you guys can hear me okay. So yeah, my job today is to give you kind of the nuts and bolts of starting any remote or type of telehealth, telepractice work for research, outreach, training purposes. Right now I am on postdoc at the Institute on Community Integration, like Frank said. And I've worked in terms of telehealth research for about the last 5 to 6 years in various capacities. So I have some experience pre-COVID, and I know a lot of people are now pivoting to a lot of these different strategies to keep their work going. So if there's anything specific that I don't talk about today or you want more information about, feel free to reach out to me. My email's on the screen there. Okay. So like I said, just a quick roadmap of what I'm going to go over today. I'll describe the different models of telehealth and what that might look like. Also, we'll talk about some considerations. These are just broad recommendations and things to think about as you're starting up, or again, maybe you're already doing some of these strategies and would like to learn about how to do different types of ones. And then we'll discuss some common problems. There's technology is fantastic, obviously, and I know everyone's probably an expert at Zoom by now, given the last few months doing all of your meetings probably via Zoom. So I'm sure a lot of you know a lot of these tech troubleshooting tips already, but we'll briefly go over those as well. And then just going to give a brief overview of some of the CEHD projects and resources that we have for you. Okay, and Ellen, I don't have the chat up, and Frank, I don't have the chat up right now, so if anyone needs to jump in, just give me a holler and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll follow it.
Okay, thanks. So we'll start out with what telehealth is. So this is the WHO definition. It is broader than telemedicine, but it includes any computer-assisted telecommunication to support the management, surveillance, and access to medical knowledge. So it's really connecting with people in terms of expertise. You might also hear other people call it telepractice, telecommunication, telemedicine, depending on who you're talking to. And these are those models I was briefly kind of talking about. So there are two major camps. So on top there we have synchronous, which is kind of what we're doing right now. It means that you're connecting with somebody live. And then we have asynchronous, which means you're not connecting live, but it's a more store and forward type of model where maybe I collect a video and then I upload it for a provider or a researcher or somebody to take a look at, and they give feedback either they can do it live or they can give feedback in a different form via email, obviously via a recording as well. And so sometimes in the literature you'll see a mixture of both. A lot of we did a recent literature review on the different types and the current trends. And we're seeing across the board, a lot of people are using different strategies, but a lot of people are still actually in this far right camp, which is like online learning modules. And I'd be interested to hear how people that do in-person training are kind of pivoting to those types of models right now. I'm not going to talk as much about that today, but just to give you a sense of the different ways you can use tele to enhance your practice and research and outreach. So here's we'll start out with the considerations. We'll start out with hardware. Again, it's probably pretty obvious, but you got to start somewhere, right? So you need a device to connect to the internet. You need internet, first of all, and you need a device. So you can use computer, tablets, and smartphones work pretty well. We've had experience with all three of those different devices, and we've been able to run sessions pretty air-free on each of those. Again, the technology is pretty advanced these days. And really, it's more about ensuring that people have equitable access to internet and those devices. So at one point, we did have a lending library, for instance, where for some research purposes, we would send out equipment. Right now, given the COVID context, this might look a little different given that if there's only one device in the home, for instance, and mom or dad or caregiver, whoever needs to use it for work, that might limit kind of how you can connect with those types of people. So there are, people are looking for little pots of money to make sure that they can get devices to connect with people. And then, people are being pretty creative about accessing internet as well. I know USI, I think, in Minneapolis, it's still free right now, but they made it free for everybody, which is the Minneapolis Wi-Fi network. I also saw in the news, that they were using buses and driving around locations. But we have worked with a lot of rural families as well in some of our work that we've done. And sometimes that requires a better signal. So we can use hotspots or anything that can connect to a cellular type of signal to connect to the internet. And then in terms of web cameras, a lot of the internal cameras work well. It kind of just depends on your needs. Most of them, like I said, are built in with computers and tablets and smartphones these days, but they can eat up your bandwidth pretty quickly. So it kind of depends on your needs. If you need a really crisp video and really time synced and time locked to your audio, if that's important for your research or your training, then you might want to think about an external web camera that can be connected either via your USB or a Bluetooth. And then some additional equipment, tripods, pop sockets work well to prop up devices. Sometimes if you need an enhanced signal around maybe verbal communication, for instance, you might want to have an extra microphone. And then Bluetooth headsets work well as for coaching purposes or for any types of interviewing. Here are some software considerations to think about when you're utilizing telehealth in whatever form you are. Number one is, and this is the number one question we get all the time, is video conferencing platform. So as you all know, and you're on Zoom right now, we use Zoom at the University of Minnesota. We have a business agreement, which essentially just means we have an agreement where it is HIPAA compliant. So The software and the video conferencing platforms are pretty much the same across the board. I mean, they have different features. What makes them different in terms of HIPAA compliance is whether you have a business agreement or not. And so the University of Minnesota does have one with Zoom, and so we use Zoom. However, the government has relaxed those regulations right now. They're not enforcing HIPAA compliance with those video platforms because they were trying to pivot and get everyone up and running as soon as possible to continue service, to continue research and those types of things. And so those are lax right now. But again, if you're thinking about pivoting to this long term and thinking about future projects, you might want to invest in start up with something that is HIPAA compliant. And then Google Meets is now available for everybody. If that wasn't the case before, we always had access within G Suite, again, within the University of Minnesota. Something to keep in mind there that works really well with the specific browser, which is Chrome. And so those are some of the platforms that you can use. We've had reports, though, like in the community, for instance, in the Somali community, they like to use WhatsApp. So we know some providers, for instance, are using WhatsApp right now. A lot of people use FaceTime. So we'll get to the IRB part, but you just have to be clear about what you're using and why you're using it and with who you're using it. But a lot of the features, like I said, are pretty similar. What I like about Zoom is that they have enhanced security features, which we'll go over, but that's what we use right now. So another consideration is if you're going to record videos, you need some type of screen capture recording. You obviously can record within Zoom, for instance, like we're recording right now, but there are other screen captures types of software. For instance, the University of Minnesota, we have access to Screencast-O-Matic. If you're using any of this remote technology for training purposes, obviously we use Canvas here, but you could also use Google Suite. You could record in PowerPoint or Zoom. There's a lot of different options, and I'm sure in terms of training, obviously there's a lot of dialogue right now and resources being generated to get everyone up and running for any distance learning, but that also obviously helps us with training purposes. And then in terms of communication, so sometimes you'll have to communicate outside of a video chat or a video conference. And so we typically use email, but you could also set up a separate application, such as a Slack channel, where you're communicating back and forth within that application. And then another consideration is storage. How are you going to store any of these files, especially the ones, if they're videos, how are you going to keep them secure and private? We use a box, which is obviously encrypted and secure, but another option may be an encrypted hard drive, for instance. So some protocol considerations. I have the IRB information at the end, and Frank's email from a few, I don't know, maybe it was like 2 months ago now, around the research guidelines, and obviously out of the research office can provide you with more resources, but obviously if you're pivoting or you're putting in a new proposal, you need to make sure that that's cleared with the IRB. There's obviously the different tiers that are operating right now, so just know what tier you're in making those modifications. In terms of providing informed consent, something in the past that we've done, but is can be tricky logistically, is you do informed consent and then you need the actual consent form back, and it's a little cumbersome, especially right now, for a lot of people to fill that out and send it through the mail or scan it. So an easy kind of in between that the IRB does approve right now is using an online consent form, for instance. Obviously you still have to do informed consent, but to capture those consent forms, you could use something like Qualtrics or DocuSign. And then ensuring privacy and security in your protocol, you want to make sure you have something regarding how you're going to keep your video conference, for instance, secure. You can obviously, we don't have it locked right now, but you could lock your Zoom room, for instance, as soon as you are connected with the person that you are conducting your research or outreach or training with. You can use a password so you can make sure that no one can Zoom bomb you, for instance. Actually, last week I had a goat in one of my meetings because the room was not locked. It was funny, but obviously you could see how that could be a problem in terms of research and any practice you're doing. And then finally, making sure you're saving any data to those encrypted storage devices. And then you could always use a VPN. If you're using your at-home Wi-Fi network, for instance, VPN is probably a best bet in terms of securing that Wi-Fi signal. And then, ensuring that you have checklists, making sure you're going through all the different scenarios and what your needs are. So how are you going to connect and set up a session with an end user? Think about those different steps. What are you going to do during your session? This is just a way to connect with people or groups or organizations, but you need to think through very carefully what you're going to do. And then how are you collecting data? Are you going to record live? What are the different data collection methods you're going to use? And then if it is across multiple sites, multiple states, international, how are you going to coordinate across those different stakeholders or people? And then finally, some safety concerns. So in the past, in some of our current work as well, we deal with some high-risk behaviors. And so you need to think through, if you're not there in person and you see some of these high-risk behaviors that could ultimately involve someone getting hurt or requiring someone to de-escalate the situation, or even if you're asking about trauma or things that are that could be triggering to people, what are those safeguards that you have in place to ensure that the person and or family or caregivers are going to be okay, and what are the lists of things that you're going to do in terms of a contingency plan if things do go wrong during your session. Obviously, you should always subscribe to your ethical guidelines and your professional scope, making sure that you are practicing within those. And then making sure you do have a termination criteria set. So if a session is not going well, or you're seeing a lot of high-risk behaviors, for instance, at what point do you terminate the session? And again, what is that contingency plan? And then, of course, we are mandated reporters. So if you see something during one of your sessions, making sure that anybody working or conferencing with a family, a person, organization knows the proper channels to make those reports. And then finally, some setup considerations. Again, it depends on your needs and what you're doing. So some people just do interviews back and forth like this, so you probably don't need a whole wide view of the room, but some people do more interactive types of protocols. And so making sure that you're connecting with the end user and really taking the time to set up where you want to do your sessions. Placing the camera up high or the device up high can be helpful if you're working with little ones like we do, that are very grabby and like to go right for the device. And then again, making sure you're connecting before your session kicks off. So before you collect any data, ensure that the participants or the end users know how to use the technology that they're using, know how to use the platform. We do something called a technology and environmental check to make sure that we're on the same page with that participants, and making sure that there's nothing in the environment if we're running certain protocols that could potentially provide a safety hazard. And then again, ensuring if we do our best to make things as equitable as possible, and we're thinking really hard about this proactively as we're rapidly putting in grant applications right now. But making sure that you have access to interpreter services as needed, using subtitles, for instance, or if you're working with deaf, hard of hearing types of communities, making sure you have access to those types of services. And then obviously our culturally and linguistically diverse families, how we're including and making sure that they can access our research, training, and outreach. So here's a quick video clip. This is my daughter and my husband. I'm gonna take out my earbuds real quick here, because something you'll learn is that, okay, hopefully you guys can still hear me. Something you'll learn is that when you're recording your screen, it doesn't record if you are using a headset sometimes. So I just want to make sure that everyone can hear this. So I'm going to play this quick. And so this is just an example of a setup. So this is a joint attention task that we are practicing. You can see the camera is pretty down low, so we can see both participants. And then my camera is off during this as I'm coaching. And, you know, that can, oops, it's flipping back onto my AirPods. Okay. All right, hopefully you guys can hear me. Okay, I'm just gonna play this before it flips back on me. Always a tech problem, right? She'll look at it. Good job. You can give her some tickles. Good. Okay, she looked at you. Go ahead and give. All right, so that just gives you a quick example of a joint attention task. Again, my camera was off to save on bandwidth. And the camera setup is pretty down low. But again, it just depends on what your needs are. And Elmo is a big hit at our house right now, if you can't tell. All right. Some tickle. Okay, go. So some common problems quick before I think wrap up. Keeps changing back to my AirPods. All right, can you hear me? Frank, can you?
We can hear you.
Yeah,
okay,
we can
great,
hear
thank
you. I'm going to be a moderator and tell you, you hit 18 minutes.
Oh, I did, shoot, okay.
Yes.
I had no
I have
idea.
I have a question in the queue for you, but go ahead and finish with your slide.
Okay, so quickly, you know, internet connectivity is probably a #1 problem that involves bandwidth. So doing speed tests, for instance, how many people are online? What are they doing? Are they watching Netflix? Maybe you should stop streaming while you're doing your sessions. Where's your router located? Where's your modem located in your house? Sometimes getting closer in proximity to those things can help with bandwidth. And then obviously turning off cameras can really optimize the audio. And in terms of audio and visual issues, what we just kind of talked about, making sure your drivers are up to date, making sure your browser is up to date, and that everything is working. And then, you know, the age-old, when in doubt, restart. It's not rocket science, but it does work. And so real quick, here's some teleuse across CEHD. On the left here, we had a story on some of the work we're doing last February in terms of some autism types of interventions that we're conducting via telehealth. We have the home inventory that's being used in terms of a teleuse and in-home use. The Research and Training Center on Community Living has conducted some interviews with people out in the community with tele. And then Project Base, which is Frank's arrow one, we conduct some play sessions using telepractice. And then Check and Connect, for instance, is pivoting right now to a remote model. They're using the Slack channel and they're doing some of the training via video conference as well. And then we are a new Echo site, and that specifically is for addressing the opioid crisis. Here are some resources. There's the IRB information, the Zoom. Just real quick, one caveat about Zoom is if you're going to be using PHI, you need a health care account. And so that information is there. And then technical assistance, there is national organizations that specifically work on providing a bunch of resources, great documentation on there. You can take a look at the national consortium there. And then there are emails if you want to reach out. I'm sorry, I went over. Sorry to my other presenters, I didn't mean to. Okay.
I'm going to do one question from Heidi in ICI. If you want to try to field this.
Hi, Heidi. Sure.
And then Jessica's next. So from Heidi, I have to, well, never mind, she has to leave early. She's wondering how you address when the end users have economic challenges getting access to reliable internet or devices. Are there stipends or grants that you use so that those who do not have the means can participate?
Yeah, that's a common question we're getting right now. You know, I don't know any specific grant resources. I'd be happy to look into that a little closer for you. You know, obviously, since you're a fellow ICI here, I'd be happy to do that. But yes, that's one main barrier to using this type work and the remote access is if they don't have devices or internet, then this is not going to work. Like I said, there was a couple, within Minneapolis, they're obviously using the Minneapolis Wi-Fi for free right now. I don't know about libraries in terms of giving devices right now, but the flip side is a tablet, a Fire tablet runs you about $60. So, including that as a line item in grant applications, again, thinking strategically about that is probably important right now. But I'm sorry, I don't have any specific pots of money that I can recommend right now, unless Frank or Ellen.
Well, I think I was just going to say I would build it, if it,
Yeah.
the research or training or the cost can be built into then help offset those for any given family. I'm going to do one more quick one. What if the only PHI is the identifiable face you recorded on Zoom? Do you still need the HCC version?
Yes, it's still PHI.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Jessica.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Adele.
Thanks, Adele. Yeah, and we do, I hope everyone can hear me and see me. So maybe just like a thumbs up if somebody can, somebody's hearing me, or stop me if you don't.
Thumbs up.
Thank you. We do build in equipment into budgets, just knowing that families will need it. And then also you can do a hotspot, or you can do a tablet with loaded, like a 3G or something on it. So we have some kind of like specs around that we'd be happy to share. I'm going to put on my stopwatch here so I don't go over. And hello, everybody. I'm Jessica Simisak, and like Adele, I work at the Institute on Community Integration here at the U. And a little bit about ICI. If you don't know us, you should. We'd love to work with you. We're within CEHD. We're the University's Center of Excellence on Developmental Disabilities. And through ICI, we do a lot of research and training and technical assistance. And within ICI, we have the ICI Telehealth Lab, which I direct. And through that lab, we do our own projects, which are, research, training, technical assistance kinds of projects. And then we also consult with other teams at the university where we will help support telehealth activities that they want to build into their projects. So please do reach out if there's ways that we can help to support your telehealth needs. So today I am tasked with really talking a lot about outreach. And as Frank said, some of our projects have, some different components to them, but I try to really focus in on how we use telehealth as a mechanism to support outreach and getting interventions and resources to people and doing projects and activities in a remote kind of a manner. So today I will very briefly talk about some barriers to intervention or training or resource being able to access those things. And then how we use telehealth to reimagine how those intervention, models can work to reach more people, provide more resources across, without geography being a big barrier. I'll give you some how-tos. I'm highlighting two specific projects. We have other projects going on, and there's a lot more details to these projects than the ones that I'll be, providing you with today. I'm trying to really focus on the tele components of them, but if you want more information, please do reach out. And really taking all the information I'm about to give you with the fact that telehealth it's but a communications tool, and there's a lot of great ways that telehealth can help to connect to other people, to deliver intervention, to collect observational data, to train, to help build resources. But at the end of the day, it is a teleconnection tool. It's technology that you can use to connect with other people. So Adele and I like to say it's kind of as good as whatever it is that you are trying to deliver. So it's as good as whatever content you have or whatever kind of intervention package you have. And so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Sometimes people will, approach us and say, like, how do we do telehealth? And we can give recommendations on how your project can run more smoothly with telehealth or something like that. But in and of itself, it's not, it's kind of just a way to connect with others. So the first project I'm going to talk through is a research and outreach project. So some components of this are research and some components of this are outreach. And it's providing rapid access to early intervention for children with autism or related neurodevelopment disabilities. And children who end up being diagnosed with autism and require, early intensive kinds of clinical intervention, face all kinds of barriers to accessing that intervention for them and their families. And this is just a list of some of those barriers, which could be the prevalence of autism is increasing. There's a lack of trained providers to provide early intervention services. And Minnesota does pretty well in this, but definitely there are barriers around just healthcare funding or state benefits to fund early intervention work. And all of this results in delays to service onset. Kids may be on wait lists for long periods of time before beginning intervention. And some kids may be in locations that don't, have the early intervention services that they need. That is definitely still a factor here in Minnesota and in other states in the nation. And of course, these kinds of disparities are increased for kids in geographic regions, such as more rural kinds of communities, kids who have more complex kinds of needs and may require more specialty of provider, kids from culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And then, as Adele would remind us if her sound was on right now, those are not just for kids in rural areas. Metro locations also, providers that are in metro locations where most of the providers are located are overwhelmed. So many of them do hold lengthy wait lists before kids can begin intervention. So these were already barriers that existed. There are, so these are barriers we've studied for a while and we've tried to innovate interventions to help address. There's definitely new barriers that are likely occurring due to our current situation that children and families are facing to accessing intervention. Just some of these may be disruption in intervention services in terms of their early intervention site. If they were at a center or something like that is closed, special education services are likely, disrupted and happening, in more of a distance learning model. As I myself can attest to, and many of us on the call, families are probably under greater stress right now with, what all the things that are going on for families, and children are probably also under greater stress. So there might be a bigger need for intervention on top of the need that was already there. And then there's also just kind of this fact that kids already were waiting to be identified and on wait lists. That's likely, growing right now because kids aren't having all their well child visits or services are, closed or operating in a lower capacity. So making the case that there already were a lot of barriers that telehealth is helping us address, and it can potentially be used to address some of these current barriers to intervention. So ways that we've used telehealth and that we envision using telehealth to innovate intervention delivery in this category is not limited to this list, but the one I was just talking about is delivering intervention earlier. So rapidly providing intervention to children as soon as possible after they've been diagnosed with autism, and potentially in the future when there's just concerns that they may have developmental delays, maybe prior to an autism diagnosis. It can also be used to train interventionists across different settings. So if a child's receiving services in a school, let's say schools are open right now in a school, and then you want to provide some coaching to their family at home, telehealth could be a great way to do that. It can also increase intervention intensity because there's not a travel component, especially for kids or sites that are further away from each other. We can potentially see children more frequently, even for shorter periods of time, so they get more opportunities to respond to the kinds of skills that we want to teach. And then telehealth can also be used to ensure maintenance across or generalization across these settings, and then also to kind of monitor maintenance as maybe we're fading an intervention that had been delivered. So, and then there's all kinds of other ways that you could potentially use it. So this is a little bit of what that pathway looks like and how we insert our intervention via telehealth. There's a developmental concern about a child. So a parent or somebody working with that child, or, help me grow, or some kind of way has a concern about a child's development. A child's then referred, if they're going on a clinical pathway, which will qualify them for, clinical services, to an evaluation site to receive an autism diagnosis. Already right there's usually a big delay in getting that evaluation because there are not a ton of evaluation clinics and there's wait lists at those clinics. So that's one delay that's happening. A second delay that's happening is after that child receives their diagnosis, before they begin intervention, there's usually also another period of delay because of all the barriers I already talked about. So a child might be sitting on a wait list while funding is figured out, or before there's an opening at a certain clinical provider. So we try to insert our model into that kind of second time point. We're not replacing really great, high quality in-person early intervention services, but we're providing supplemental parent coaching as soon as possible after that child receives a diagnosis to help the family target some really critical skills, usually based around communication kinds of skills. And we do this by partnering, working closely with evaluation clinics. So there are kids that we've been able to start on our research protocol fairly rapidly after they've received a diagnosis. Okay, so this is the how-to slide to that example. Things that we do to help this model work. We screen for safety, which Adele already spoke to. We make sure that there's not dangerous kinds of challenging behaviors going on that could be severe or someone could be injured. We do assessment first over the phone with the family, and then the assessment starts to move into observation over tele. So with video conferencing where we link directly with that family and we observe usually different routines going on with that family in their home. We make sure that they have the right equipment, as Adele spoke to. We do some tele onboarding, so we help people get comfortable with how to set up the equipment, where should we place the camera so we can see the child, and then also just reminding them about their privacy. So there might be other people in your home who don't realize the camera's on, so what can we do to make sure that we let people know we're going to be in the middle of a session. Sometimes when people are in settings that have multiple people, then we'll ask if we can work with them, the parent and their child or whoever behind a closed door and put a little sign on it. Reminding people when their sound and their camera is on or off, because I can't tell you how many times we accidentally hear somebody pick up and have like a personal phone conversation or something like that. So try to be reminding people that just teach them how to use the technology so they can protect their own privacy as well, or help us help them protect their privacy. And then when we start sessions, we do a lot of free play. We keep things really child and family centered. So we want to make sure that that child is comfortable, that the family is comfortable. We're not kind of inundating them with instructions on what to do immediately. We're kind of seeing how that child is normally playing and interacting with their family as we start to begin intervention. When we do move to intervention, we prioritize things like communication. And we try to have shorter, more frequent sessions. So maybe like 3 sessions a week that are 45 minutes in length that are based during routines. We try to minimize needing extra stuff. So we try to make it so families just using things they already have and they're not having to kind of like carry around a binder of things that we're sending to them. So that is how we use telehealth in that model. And that model runs completely remotely. Well, I should say, before it ran completely remotely on the user end, we have also had to pivot that model and that, to run it completely remotely, meaning that we are also remote, because previously those sessions would occur in the telehealth laboratory where we were on campus, and the family was remote. So we're also doing some pivoting right now. This second example, and I'll move through it really quickly, hopefully still do it justice, is a really important project we have going on with myself and Dr. Rachel Freeman and Amy Hewitt at ICI, which is improving regional capacity in both person-centered and positive behavior support practices in Minnesota. And so this, again, works with partnership and funding through the Department of Human Services. And one component of it is we use telehealth to support this kind of regional capacity building. It's before the pandemic, it was not operating completely remotely. Now we are also pivoting this project, but components of it were, and they really help the model work well. So briefly, these are different provider organizations and counties and different agencies basically that, for the most part, many of them support people with either developmental disabilities or sometimes with mental health or behavioral health kinds of concerns across the state. And counties and organizations with different regions would come together and apply each year to receive this training and technical assistance that's provided through ICI in partnership with DHS. And so this is just an example of some of those regions and then some of the types of organizations that were in those regions that have this kind of ongoing training over a period of time, over 3 years. And then they have some expansion to build on sustainability. And that really is the purpose of this model, is to help build capacity in these regions so they can provide really great person-centered and positive behavior support services within their organizations, and then also just within their region, so that they can be a resource to their own region in the state. Now, these are some components to this model. This is not the full model itself. It's much more robust than just this, but some components that we do run over telehealth, we call it tele-PBS, fun spin on the word in this example, is we provide a series of 6-day trainings for some people who are on these organizations. The organizations have to form a team. And some people on the team have kind of the responsibility of being the positive behavior support facilitator for their team. So the PBS facilitators and other members of the public, but are invited to attend these trainings and focused workshops that happen annually. These are done mainly over webinar. When we're not in the pandemic, we also have a in-person option, but that's not going on right now. In addition to that, the organizations and the PBS facilitators get visits that are organization specific. And these are synchronous video conferencing visits like what we're doing right now. And we can make data-based tools so that they can make data-based decisions, train them on how to do a functional behavior assessment, do some really great universal kinds of practices and data collection and monitoring. And they also have online learning materials and resources that are put on this site, mmpsp.org, that they can access at any time, again, with that hope that we're building capacity in these regions. Here's the how-to for this project. This one has more moving parts because it's very large. It involves different kinds of team members, but you could apply this to other kinds of outreach projects that you might have. And things that you might want to consider are those settings. Is this fully remote, meaning both parties are remote, and then right now that it has to be, but as we move beyond that, as there is capacity for on-site kinds of things, can there be satellite sites and community locations where some people are on-site and some people are remote? The types of applications like synchronous and asynchronous, who are the tele-providers and who are the tele-users? Am I training another provider to then train, people at their site? How are we using tele to enhance the model? So what pieces of this can stay, and then what pieces will we want to return to in-person, when we have the opportunity to do so? And then, like Adele kind of already spoke to this, how we're monitoring fidelity and training, et cetera. Okay, promises, I have this slide and then my recommendations and I'm done. So I gave you Minnesota examples. What if I do national or international kinds of outreach, training, or research? Great news, tele has a lot of evidence of being used in these kinds of ways as well. So it's a great way to break barriers in terms of access. Of course, you want to ensure compliance with whatever you need compliance with for what your project is, but it has been used in a lot of ways to do national or international kinds of training or coaching or research activities. For example, one thing that ICI currently supports through our lab is data collection on a large multi-site study where we collect one measure via tele for all of the sites. And so that involves a lot of that coordination that Adele talked about. And if I haven't convinced you already, I think this is a fun study that this example at the bottom was a study on basically enrollment procedures, or a study that was experiencing difficult enrollment for their participants. And they moved to remote procedures for like an intervention kind of a thing. And they went from 3 participants in their first year when they were trying to do in-person to 30 participants in their second year when they moved to remote. So they saw a great increase in being able to just recruit and enroll participants in their study. So it's another great, potential benefit, especially if you're working with a population that might be lower incidence. So some recommendations, you've already heard some. But if you're talking about like an intervention model, look at that model and think about how it could be improved. What are some barriers and how could a teleconnection break down some of those barriers or help to deliver the intervention better? And if it might not be intervention, maybe it's a training or maybe it's a location that has less expertise or specialty. Adele already gave you the link to the telehealth resource centers. Think about, as you're using platforms, you want things that are compliant and user-friendly. Remember that HIPAA goes beyond just your video conferencing platform. It's also how you're conducting the session and making sure you're in a secure environment, and et cetera, et cetera. And then that same, get familiar with video conferencing yourself. Remind people when they're on or off mute, have them practice that so that you don't accidentally, have their privacy violated. If you're in a large group like this one, go ahead and take the liberty of limiting other people's sound and audio so they don't pop off of audio by accident. I can't tell you how many webinars I've been on, not the ones that we're leading, where you hear someone having a side conversation with their spouse or somebody in the background and nobody wants to, have that happen to them. And as for yourself and your team, always act as if your sound or video is on, even if it is not. You don't want a research participant or somebody you're training to hear you say something like, whatever. I won't give an example, but that you don't intend them to hear. So just always, while you're logged into Zoom, just act as if your video was on. That's all I have. Here's our emails again. Please do reach out if you have questions or needs in telehealth, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm going to give you one question. I'm mindful of time, so I'll turn it right over to Jennifer, and we'll finish the session with her presentation as well. The question is, how do you address cultural and linguistic barriers in this process?
That's really a great question. It's something that I think it's making sure you're thinking about those things on the front end and writing those things into your grant applications and budget. So if you're outreaching to a group and you need to have, like Adele already spoke about, language transcribed, make sure that you're budgeting that in, and then just trying to have authentic connections with groups. And so, we'll sit on different organizations or interagency groups to build relationships with people so that you're not kind of trying to form those relationships really quickly right before you're trying to do some project. That'd be my answer.
Thank you. Jennifer, are you ready to roll? And so we're going to be up against time, folks. If you have further questions, everybody's provided their contact. We can get a question in with Jennifer or two, that'd be great. But in terms of a general Q&A, I'll abandon that plan.
Okay, well, let's go from the beginning. Thank you, Frank, for inviting me to present the results of one of our telehealth studies. This study was funded by the National Institute of Deafness and Communication Disorders within the National Institutes of Health. And I also want to thank Jessica and Adele both for their great presentations and for the work that they did as researchers in the early stages of this grant. I'll also thank my co-authors here, my project coordinator and postdoc extraordinaire, Dr. Becky Kolb, Sean Gertler, Alethea Shipchandler, and Emily Unholtz-Bowden are our current students and research assistants, and Shawnee will actually be presenting an illustrative case example in just a couple of minutes. So this project we worked on was funded to study communication with girls with Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is a rare neurodevelopmental disorder, so thought to affect the way that the brain develops. Classic Rett syndrome, and there are variants, is caused by a single gene mutation, the MECP2 gene on the X chromosome. And so this affects almost exclusively females. After what appears to be typical early development, parents begin to suspect that there's something unusual around 12 months or so of age, give or take a few months. And they see a slowing of development and really very then impaired motor skills typically and speech. Rett syndrome affects all areas of individuals' lives, but those two in particular are some of the most impactful for day-to-day living. And the speech and communication was the focus of our intervention, our investigation, I'm sorry. The severity of the effects of Rett syndrome varies widely, actually, across individuals. We have met girls who have no means of communication, who have severely impaired motor skills and no easily identified preferred activities. And at the other extreme, we have met girls who speak in full sentences, and children who at the age of 3 are using speech-generating devices to speak in sentences about the horses out in their field. So we really see a wide variety of effects of Rett syndrome. This image depicts the obviously the United States, but the orange spots are the specialty clinics for individuals with Rett syndrome. So there are 19 of them only in the United States. So clearly access to experts in the multiple and complex needs of individuals with Rett syndrome is extremely limited. And given the complex communication needs, with most girls and young women lacking vocal speech and having severely impaired motor skills, easy access to experts for treating complex communication needs and teaching augmentative alternative communication is almost non-existent for a majority of families. So at the time that we first wrote the first iteration of this project around 2014 or 2015, there were 2 basic thoughts about the communication abilities of individuals with Rett syndrome. The first was that they have severe and profound disabilities, they do not comprehend language, and they do not possess any expressive language abilities. The second is that they are locked into a body that doesn't work, but that they can understand everything going on around them. And if given the opportunity with technology, they could communicate as well as the rest of us. This is influenced in part by the fact that many girls with Rett syndrome frequently initiate eye contact and sustain eye contact for long periods of time. This leads the communication partner to imagine all kinds of things that the individual may be trying to express. It's undeniable that the vast majority of individuals, at least that we've worked with and that we've met with Rett syndrome, have remarkable and lovely personalities and even seem to have a sense of humor. And I want to show you, I hope I can make this work. This girl, we're doing a preference assessment with her, and her brother is actually doing the assessment. So she is laughing and smiling. She's got some gross motor abilities. She can sit unassisted, and she's able to reach. She actually crossed midline there, I think, and you may have noticed, which is sometimes difficult. And she was able to take the toy. Being behavior analysts, we have these 2 sort of ideas about communication and the functioning of girls and individuals with Rett syndrome. Obviously, I think usually when you've got polar opposites like that, the answer is something in between or some combination. And being behavior analysts and having a strong background in conducting systematic experimental analyses of behavior and functional communication training, we decided to take a very behavior analytic approach to assessing and teaching functional communication skills with individuals with Rett syndrome. And because it's a rare disease, we needed to be able to access or interact with a number of participants multiple times per week for several weeks. So the emerging telehealth technology provided a natural mechanism for accessing participants. So this project addressed 2 specific aims. The first was to establish early formal expressive communication skills. So we wanted to demonstrate empirically what parents were telling us, and that was that their children with Rett syndrome can learn to communicate and can communicate. So we were doing that with parent-implemented assessment and functional communication training across numerous contexts and routines in their natural home environment. And then the second aim was to examine the feasibility of telehealth for coaching these skills. And again, this was initially funded in 2016. The experimental designs that we used were single case designs to examine the effects of functional communication training, which involves both prompting or teaching and reinforcement on the communicative responses for each participant. And then based on individual factors, we would use either an adaptive multiple probe design or a reversal design, or often a combination of those two. We're reporting today the findings of the 19 individuals who participated in this funded project. 95% of them were female. We had one male participant. Again, males with Rett syndrome it's unusual to come across one because it's X-linked. The mean age of our participants was 10 years old, but ranged from 18 months old to 29 years old. And 68% of our participants were able to walk, at least with some assistance, potentially, possibly with a walker. And 58% were able to self-feed at least finger foods. Very few of them could actually use a spoon to eat yogurt or that kind of thing, but could eat some finger foods. And that just gives us a little bit of a sense of their fine motor skills and what they might be able to do for augmentative alternative communication modalities. So all of the girls, when we first met them, were using some sort of informal or idiosyncratic responses to communicate with people who know them well. Those included things like vocal sounds, crying, reaching, looking, those kinds of things that parents often will interpret what what is being desired or communicated from their child. But when you think about then other people who don't know the individual very well and trying to allow the individual to express a broader range of things, it's really important to be able to teach them some more formal communication. So we taught 16% of our girls to use eye pointing, and that would be to look at a particular object or to look at a picture of an object. And we did this particularly with girls who had very severe or non-existent use of their hands, and who either had 2D, 3D representation, so they could look at pictures because they understood that represented a three-dimensional object, or if they didn't have that skill yet to match a two-dimensional object and a three-dimensional object, we just had them looking at the three-dimensional object. 21% of our girls, they were able to use their hands to touch or hand a picture exchange card, or to touch a manually activated speech generating device. And then 53% of our participants we taught to use a microswitch, which is a touch plate that has a loop tape in it that you pre-record a message that's something like "play with me" or "snack please" or those kinds of things. And then later in the study, more and more families were owning speech-generating devices that are activated with eye gaze. So at the very bottom of this device here, you see a black bar with a green dot, and that green dot is calibrated to the girls' pupils, and they are able to use their eyes then to activate messages on the screen. So no participant independently produced formal communication when we started, but then we were able to use one of these ways to, to teach them to use one of these ways to communicate. So I'll just very briefly go through, very similar to what Jessica was describing, the phases of our work with our experimental phases. But I want to first point out that we actually never met any families in person during the course of the experiment. We met a handful of them during recruitment events or at the Gillette specialty clinics for Rett syndrome at Gillette Children's Hospital, but most came from referrals, and we only met them on the telephone or via telehealth. So we started with interviews and on the telephone. And then following those interviews, we connected via Google Hangouts or Google Meets at the time, and now we have shifted over to Zoom for our subsequent projects and participants. And so in the second phase, then, when we are meeting with them via telehealth, we are conducting natural observations, structured observations, preference assessments, those kinds of observations, as Jessica was describing, to really get a sense of what are those idiosyncratic responses that the girls are using for communication presently, what are the contexts in which they are using them, and what are some of their highly preferred items and activities. Because when we're going to first start teaching a communicative response, we want to teach a response that they're going to be highly motivated to engage in or to use. So, for example, if they, the case I'm going to show you in a moment, Sarah, you saw her video a moment ago, her highest preferred item was yogurt. And so we were pretty confident that if we had a container of yogurt and a spoon, that she would reach for it, because that was her idiosyncratic response, and that we could teach her to press a micro switch to gain access to that yogurt, because she was very motivated to get the yogurt, and the switch press produced the yogurt. And through all of these, we were not providing direct services to the individuals with Rett syndrome. We were coaching family members, mostly parents, but sometimes siblings, to conduct all of the procedures. And the final step then was the functional communication intervention, which the family members implemented, and again involved prompting and reinforcing a formal communicative response, like the microswitch or the eye gaze device. And we then conducted that within the context of experimental analysis. I'm going to take you through one very brief case example. Sarah, you saw a video of her a moment ago. She was 6 years old. Her only vocalization was a laugh. And when we were interviewing her family, her mom said that they owned an eye gaze device. The most popular one is called a Toby, but it was in a box in the closet. They never really, they used it a couple of times, but didn't really, it wasn't preferred and it was too complicated, so they didn't use it. Which is a shame, because they're very, very expensive. And potentially can really allow the girls to have a lot of expressive communication. So when we were observing and interviewing, we found that her most reliable idiosyncratic communicative responses were reaches or touches. And so the first communicative device that we used was a microswitch, and then we did move, once she was learning, she learned the microswitch and she was discriminating among messages among microswitches, then we moved to the Toby, the eye gaze device, for more complex communications. And so our goal with her was independent requests, and then later on became social interactions. So our primary research question here was to, as you recall maybe, was to demonstrate that girls with Rett could learn to communicate. So here we were simply showing that when she reached for the yogurt, we reinforced the reach. And the microswitch was present, but she never touched it. And this is the percentage of opportunities across 5 trial sessions. So each of these sessions is 5 trials. I hope you can see my arrow, my cursor. Then we changed conditions to reinforcing her requesting or manding for the yogurt, her highly preferred item. And she's requesting 100% of the time using the microswitch, and she's not reaching at all. Then in this experimental design, this one is a reversal design. We reverse back to reinforcing her reaching for the yogurt, and that's what the behavior that we see. And then we go back to reinforcing her mand or use of the microswitch for the yogurt, and that's the behavior we see. We do actually see a little bit more reaching in that final phase. If you think that this is odd, these immediate changes without an acquisition process, ask me about it at the end of my presentation, because I can tell you more about that. With our early participants, we stopped after this point, because the question was, can we teach them to communicate and to use formal means of communication? And the answer was yes. We would stop after 1 or 3 messages. As we were learning that, it became very clear very quickly, empirically, with all of our data, that the children were learning, the individuals were learning to communicate using formal means, and the parents were more interested in much more complex kinds of communications, we started extending our research questions to teaching multiple messages, discriminating among messages, and teaching multiple modalities. And so Shawnee is going to take you through one case where we taught her, Shawnee primarily, some more complex communication.
Okay, so I will discuss Nina. Nina is a 20-year-old female with Rett syndrome. She lives at home with both of her parents, and during the school year, when schools are open, she attends a transition age program at her community school. Her baseline communication skills, she had one vocal word for done, and was reliably making choices between two items. She does have the use of her hands, but did not have a reliable AAC or augmentative and alternative communication system, even though she owned an iPad with a Proloquo system on it and she had pictures available. She did not use them independently or reliably. So we worked on two different communication modalities for her, a high-tech and a low-tech version. It was important for us to teach both for her because high-tech AAC can sometimes break, or it might not be as portable as the low-tech or the pictures would be. So across the two, on the left is the Proloquo to go, which was on an iPad. It's a touchscreen activated device. And on the right is the low-tech, which is the picture exchange communication system. The great thing about the high-tech is that the researcher can modify the Proloquo profile and send it to the participant in real time if any changes need to be made. And for the picture exchange system, we followed the PECS protocol starting in phase 1, which is the requesting an item and receiving the item. Our icons between the two systems matched as closely as possible, but because we used different software to create both of them, they were a little bit different and they were not identical. Her low-tech was just a 3-ring binder with 3 different category pages with Velcro and laminated icons. So these 3 graphs show our low-tech page linking. So page linking is a form of navigation, and low-tech is where she would open up her book and page through to find the category that she was motivated for. Previous to this, she had mastered the PECS phase 1, which is the exchange, and also travel. So she would go and get her book. And lastly, she mastered discrimination within each category without any page linking or flipping through the book. Our y-axis for all of the graphs that we'll see going forward is percentage of responses independent, and our x-axis are 5 trial sessions. Going from top to bottom, we'll see TV show, drinks, and food. And then once each category was mastered in the related field size, another category was added. When drinks and food were added, the performance was lower and then increased through teaching sessions. And then she did master all 3 categories. So going through her book to find the related category and exchanging her icon. We did a preference assessment with her, and she did prefer her high-tech communication modality, but was actually more reliable and independent with her low-tech category, her low-tech modality. Next, we'll look at her high-tech page linking, and this is just for her TV show category. And the next 2 slides are going to overlay the 2 other categories, but there's a lot of data points. So for the purposes of demonstration, they'll be overlaid on top of each other. But this first one in the black triangles is TV show. And because she had previously mastered in discrimination up to 6 within the category, we opened up her categories in a field size of 3, targeting just TV show first. And it took us a couple of trial and error with trying out TV show, food and drink to see that just because she was able to discriminate in a field size of 4 to 6 within the specific item category didn't mean that for category she was able to do that as well, likely because it's a more abstract concept to look at categories versus the actual item, which has more one-to-one correspondence with the picture and then the item itself. And then the next category that we added was drinks, which is the black squares, and then the gray triangles are now the TV shows. And then the third one that we added is the food category, which are the black circles. So between all three, she was able to master all categories in a field size of 1. Then we moved them to a field size of 2. And how we switched field sizes, we used a sticky note to cover one of the non-related or targeted categories. So we just reduced the field size from 3 categories to 2. And then we remove the sticky notes and just target it in a field size of 3. We eventually used a gesture prompt to select categories, and we were able to fade that away. So now she has complete independence to navigate through her device to get into whatever category she's motivated for. And our last graph is for once she's into the category page, we wanted to teach her how to page link or navigate back to the home screen. So the picture on the left shows from what the category looks like. When she clicks on the food icon, it opens up to the icons of jelly bean and cookie, and then she hits that back arrow to go back to her home page to make another request. Her baseline sessions were between 0 to 20% for the 3 baseline sessions, and then after 2 teaching trials at 60%, it increased to 80 and then 100% independence for her to link back to her main page. And our next step for her would be to clear that communication strip at the top of her communication device. It's her next step for her program.
Thanks, Johnny. So then just finally, our overall outcomes are for 100% of our participants have acquired at least 1 message, and 77% of our participants acquired 2 or more messages. And that was our primary research question. Then as we became interested in some of the more complex aspects of communication, as Shawnee was describing, we worked with 26% of our participants to learn, to teach them discrimination, and 100% of those participants that we worked on discrimination with acquired discrimination skills. And with 21% of our participants, we worked on teaching page linking, the kind of navigation that Shawnee was talking about, and 100% of those participants have acquired page linking. Finally, we assessed caregiver acceptability ratings of both functional communication training intervention and the use of telehealth as a service delivery mechanism. And on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being the highest, the mean acceptability has been 5.6. So thank you for your time. I know we're a little over time, and I will turn it over to Frank for questions.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Shawnee. Let's see. Oh, okay, we're still going. What I want to remark on in my own quick reflection on on that data set and then across the session, the part of the purpose of asking these 3 individuals is the range and the depth you can go, and I think we saw that. So there are technical issues for startup. There is a great capacity for this remote research strategy, TELA in particular, for extending our reach, whether that's training and service or research. And then we saw with Jennifer and Shawnee that these are idiographic, individual, intensive assessment intervention and this was all completed with TELA. So that's what I wanted to remind people of, the illustration of that point. That's it that I have for just a quick comment. Are there any questions hanging out there for folks that have hung through? I know we went a little bit over, but that's okay. Either question specific for Jennifer or Shawnee on how they managed to do what they did with TELA, or anything more general across the session. I'll just give a pause for a moment if anything comes up in chat. Or we're a smaller group if we want to unmute and ask. Or people are saying it's 12:15, we're zoomed out and we want to go eat. That's fair too. Okay, seeing none, we put up a couple times in chat the link for where this session, the recorded session will be posted. You have access to that. Everybody generously provided their emails, so please feel free as questions come up that you have or your group has, if you take these ideas back to them of being able to use TELA to pivot, you can follow up directly with our presenters. I'll remind you, if you need to, think about your IRB and what you need to do to add tele as an element of remote. It could be straight just for recruitment or remote for data collection, etc. And with that, I'm going to thank our presenters again. Those were excellent. I really appreciate it. Again, I know this is a busy time typically, and more so right now. I hope everybody stays well and safe, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you, and bye-bye.